Section 80 of History of the Revolutions in Europe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark DeSanzo. History of the Revolutions in Europe by Christoph Koch, translated by Maximilian Schull. French Revolution of February 1848, Part 3. The elections for the National Assembly caused great excitement throughout all France, and there was, or appeared to be, reason to believe that in the provinces the Republic was not quite so popular as in Paris. The danger here the provisional government deemed fit to provide against, for it was justly felt that if by any combination of circumstances an assembly should be elected containing a majority of anti-republicans, a state of anarchy and bloodshed would most probably be the consequence. The Republicans, if proved to be in a minority, would show themselves a continual source of alarm and mischief, a minority that never would submit, and that would change itself into a majority by dint of its zeal, energy, and strength of conviction. To prevent this renewal of a struggle, of which the only possible result could be the triumph, at a somewhat later period, of Republican principles, M. Le Rollin and M. Carnot issued circulars to their agents, which excited much indignant remark. That of M. Le Rollin was the most bold and attracted the greatest blame. It expressly declared that the agents of the government should use all means at their command to secure or forward the return of Republican candidates. The circular of M. Carnot took the same ground, and insisted that it was better to choose an uneducated Republican from the ranks of the peasantry or the workmen than an educated royalist, however great his reputation or pure his character. The object of this proclamation was somewhat misunderstood as meaning that in all cases an uneducated was better than an educated representative. This, however, he never stated, but on the contrary appealed to the teachers in the public schools throughout the country to offer themselves as candidates, showing them the career that was opened to talent and learning by the Republic, and merely insisting that republicanism was the first requisite for a seat in the Assembly. Republicanism with education, if possible, but on no account education without republicanism. This was his meaning, and his advice was generally acted upon. Candidates were found in sufficient numbers combining both requisites, by which the Assembly was saved from the scandal that would most undoubtedly have resulted had men been elected with the one qualification only. The number of operatives out of employment increased at so rapid and alarming a rate that at the close of 1 month they were expected to number 75,000. The expense of paying them at 1 franc 50 centimes a day would amount to 112,500 francs, and even Louis Blanc admitted that it would be impossible for the government to continue such an outlay unless the labor performed should become really useful and productive. On Saturday, the 15th of April, the various communist clubs, whose organization was complete and extensive, gave orders to the working class for a grand demonstration upon the following day. On Sunday, the 16th, the first outbreak occurred. From an early hour in the morning, groups of workmen assembled in the Champ de Mars, where it had been fixed that the elections of the captains of the staff of the National Guard, destined to represent the working classes, were to be held. These elections passed off quietly enough, but it soon became known that the party of Blanqui, the communist, and other men of extreme opinions were anxious to induce the workmen to make a demonstration in their favor, which caused the greatest alarm among the middle classes and led to the most extravagant reports. Although these rumors were not credited by reasonable people, it was deemed prudent that the National Guard should be called out. Accordingly, the rappel was beaten in every quarter, and in a few minutes after, shops were closed and the National Guard might be seen hurrying to the different places of rendezvous of their respective companies. For some time the town presented the appearance of the memorable day of the 24th of February. Houses were closed, women and children stood at the doors in anxious discussion, armed men hurried to and fro, anxiety depicted on every countenance. But there was one great difference between that day and that of the Revolution. There were no barricades. Meanwhile, the crowd on the Champ de Mars continued to increase, and it soon amounted, according to most calculations, to 100,000 men, whilst the multitude looking on was nearly as great. After the workmen of the different trades had elected their respective officers, they made a collection among themselves which they destined as a patriotic gift to the government, and moved in procession to the Hôtel de Ville. All the afternoon the National Guards and the Garde Mobile were under arms and occupied all the principal places, the Place de la Bourse, the Place du Carrousel, the Place de la Concorde, etc. Patrols of them also traversed the streets. The manner in which the National Guard acted excited unbounded admiration among the middle and respectable classes of society, struck the communist parties with dismay, and greatly strengthened the moderate section of the provisional government. This section, though forming the majority, was continually kept in check by the dread of the immense physical power which it was supposed that the minority, Ledru Rollin, Flocon, Albert, and Louis Blanc, had at their command. But this demonstration proved that the real physical power of Paris, consisting of the National Guard, the Garde Nationale Mobile, and other forces, were not only in favor of the moderate party, but ready and even anxious to crush their enemies, who were also the enemies of law and order. To this force the moderate section of the government could have added from 20,000 to 30,000 regular troops who were stationed within easy reach of Paris. On Tuesday morning, the 18th, at 6 o'clock, the rappel for the assembling of the National Guards was beaten in all quarters of Paris, in consequence of information that the communists and most violent of the clubs had determined on another attempt to overthrow the provisional government, to establish a committee of public safety, and to attack the Hôtel de Ville. During the night, great numbers of the communists assembled in the neighborhood of the Hôtel de Ville and the Tuileries, uttering threats against the moderate members of the government. The intentions of the quote-unquote people being made somewhat clear by these events, and the danger to society being somewhat more manifest than before, the government became anxious to discover whether it could with safety resort to a step so bold as the reintroduction of the troops of the line to Paris. The National Guard was worn out and harassed, and would hail the return of the troops as the greatest boon that could be offered them. But the working classes and communists might be mistrustful. To inquiries made both openly and secretly by the emissaries or employés of the government, a satisfactory reply was obtained, and at length it was decided that the troops should be recalled. It was not wise, however, to allow the real secret of their recall to be promulgated, and a scheme was adopted to throw the people off their guard and flatter their national and proverbial love of grand spectacles by one which should cast into the shade by its magnificence all the previous spectacles of the Revolution. The grand festival of fraternity was devised and passed off in the most brilliant manner. As early as 5 o'clock, on the morning of the 20th of April, the drums were beat for the assembling of the different legions of the National Guards. By 8, all Paris seemed to have poured down into the street. The day was dull, drizzly, and dreary, but the ardor neither of the actors in the mighty show nor of the crowds of spectators was to be damped. Countless throngs poured along the Champs-Élysées to the chief point of interest. The immense estrade, erected beneath and before the Arch of Triumph, with its ascending galleries and tribunes and decorations of Roman and Grecian attributes, was not without a certain grandeur of effect. Upon this estrade were assembled all the generals, the courts, and the tribunals, the wounded of the days of February, delegates from the schools, the commissions and associations of the working classes, and from the clubs. On either side, and in the galleries behind, was a crowd of privileged spectators and ladies admitted by tickets. The ceremonies were announced to commence at 9 o'clock. At 8 the tribunes had been filled, but it was past 10 before the main body of the members of the provisional government made their appearance. An address to the armed force was read by M. Arago as Minister of War. About 11 o'clock began the display. Nothing could be more imposing than the flood of bayonets as it poured up the long avenue of the Champs-Élysées towards the Arch of Triumph. The different troops were mingled in the order of their approach, now a legion of the Garde Mobile, now a regiment of the line, a legion of the National Guards, the schools, the associations of artisans, then cavalry and infantry. Across the Place de la Concorde, down the ex-Rue Royale, now called the Rue Nationale, and along the line of the boulevards, the scene was the same. The ferment of the returning troops and the swarming crowds continued until long after midnight. The whole city was brilliantly illuminated. It was expected that during the night, when all the National Guards were exhausted by fatigue, a fresh attempt would be made by the ultras, but nothing of the kind took place. The number of men under arms during the day amounted to 400,000. At night, the illumination in the Champs-Élysées presented a fairy-like scene. Lights, festooned from tree to tree, were hung from the Place de la Concorde all the way to the magnificent Triumphal Arch, and then the vista was terminated by a splendid display of various colored lamps. All the public buildings, of course, shone resplendent, and the Chamber of Deputies and the noble edifices on the Place de la Concorde glared with lights and added to the glories of the scene. In the midst of all this, hosts of Republicans, male and female, sang their songs with that light-heartedness peculiar to the Parisian. In the meantime, the elections for the Assembly had commenced, and were conducted for the most part with great tranquillity, regularity, and order. It was remarked as a singular thing in Paris that not more than 1/3 of all the persons entitled to vote exercised the franchise. The working classes hung back, a fact greatly lamented. It proved that the French, though skilled in effecting revolutions, were so little alive to the value of liberty as to be indifferent to the right to vote, the great privilege of the freemen, and, on the other hand, it created the apprehension that it was not by peaceful constitutional means, but by actual violence, that the working classes were disposed to cause their wishes to prevail. Late on Monday night, the 24th of April, the ballot boxes were closed and the elections terminated. The general examination of the votes was fixed for Friday, the 28th of April, by an order of the mayor of Paris, who also laid down the regulations to be followed on the occasion. Candidates who obtained more than 2,000 votes, according to the order of suffrages given to them, were proclaimed quote-unquote representatives of the people by the mayor. The elections throughout France generally showed a large majority in favor of the moderate party. Some monarchists, but few, found their way to the chamber. The Assembly met on the day appointed, and an immense multitude assembled on the Place de la Concorde, on the bridge, and in all the places commanding a view of the National Palace, as the building formerly known as the Chamber of Deputies was called. On the demand of General Cortet, the commander of the National Guard, the Assembly showed itself bodily to the people upon the peristyle of the building, and the Republic was proclaimed, amid the waving of innumerable banners, the firing of artillery, and the shouts of the delighted multitude. All the preliminaries having been gone through, powers verified, a president, M. Boucher, and vice-presidents, secretaries, etc., appointed, the members of the government proceeded to lay before the Assembly an account of their ministries since the establishment of the Republic. On Saturday, May 6, Minister Lamartine ascended the tribune, and read a document which purported to be a report of the acts of the Provisional Government in the restoration of order, the organization of the National Guard, Mobile Guard, the Army, etc., enumerating what had been done in the midst of 2 months of a crisis during which not a drop of blood had been shed. Many portions of this report were much applauded. He was succeeded by Ledru Rollin, the Minister of the Interior, who read a report of the acts of his administration with great vehemence. The Minister of Justice, M. Wehmeyer, next ascended the tribune, and proceeded to read a report of his official acts, in which he recounted all the ameliorations applied to the administration of justice, the abolition of capital punishment for political offences, abolition of the pillory, etc. The next member of the government who ascended the tribune was M. Louis Blanc, who delivered an extempore oration in favor of his Organisation du Travail, to which, he said, the government was committed by its promises to the people assembled before the Hôtel de Ville the day after the Revolution. His oration was received with coldness. M. Carnot, the Minister of Public Instruction, was afterwards heard, and was succeeded by M. Bechemont, the Minister of Commerce, who laid on the table a sketch of the state of his department. M. Garnier-Paget, Minister of Finance, concluded his report on the financial condition of the country. M. Arago, the Minister of War and Marine, and M. Marie, the Minister of Public Works, next presented the situation of their departments, and were succeeded by M. Lamartine, Minister for Foreign Affairs, who took a short review of the aspect of affairs throughout Europe. The general tone of his remarks was pacific and in accordance with the principles of his address some time before to the diplomatic agents of France. In the course of the sitting, a note from Béranger, the poet, resigning his seat for Paris was read, but the Assembly unanimously refused to accept the resignation. A stormy discussion then arose on the motion of M. d'Ornès, offering the thanks of the Assembly to the Provisional Government for their conduct in the administration of affairs, and nominating a committee of 5 to act as a government ad interim until the permanent government of the country had been constituted. Subsequently, the motion was modified by the withdrawal of the latter part of it, and the Assembly voted that the provisional government had deserved well of the country. The vote was almost unanimous. On Tuesday, at 11 o'clock, M. Boucher, the president, took the chair. It was feared that the result of this sitting would occasion disturbances. A large force was stationed in the adjoining gardens, and invitations had been sent to the National Guards to be in readiness to march at the first signal. On the following Wednesday, the appointment of an executive committee in lieu of the provisional government was announced. The result of the ballot was Arago, 725, Garnier-Pagès, 715, Marie, 702, Lamartine, 643, Ledru-Rollin, 598. Those 5 members having obtained the required majority were proclaimed members of the executive committee. M. Louis Blanc, M. Albert, and M. Flocon were entirely excluded, a fact which the people and the communists cherished in vindictive remembrance. M. Ledru-Rollin, whose violence had alarmed the majority, was at the bottom of the list, and M. de Lamartine, who had lent his high name and great popularity to support M. Ledru-Rollin, was placed next lowest, all being most significant facts to show the spirit of the Assembly and the probable policy to be hereafter expected from it. While these scenes had been taking place at Paris, the working classes at Rouen, Elbeuf, and other manufacturing towns, alarmed that the revolution would not take up the questions of socialism and communism, and decree labor and food to every man, whether idle or industrious, skilled or unskilled, had been in considerable agitation. On Monday, the 15th of May, Paris was the scene of another revolutionary struggle. The National Assembly was surrounded and entered by thousands of the population, led by Barbès, Blanqui, Hubert, and others, who drove the deputies from their seats and, amid a scene of indescribable tumult, assumed the functions of government. General Cortet, commander of the National Guard, had treasonably opened the gates of the Assembly to the mob, and the prefect of police, M. Caussidière, was supposed to be another of the conspirators. Louis Blanc was also implicated in the plot, and thus organized and supported, the insurrection manifested itself. Having forced their way into the National Assembly, the conspirators were not slow to announce their objects and intentions. With a drawn sword in his hand, Barbès addressed the Assembly and proclaimed that a contribution of 1,000 millions of francs should be levied on the rich for the benefit of the poor, that a tax of another 1,000 millions should be paid by the rich for the aid of Poland, that the National Assembly should be dissolved, and an executive government, composed of Barbès, Albert, Louis Blanc, Flocon, Blanqui, Raspail, and Cabet, be immediately appointed. He concluded his proposals by demanding the re-establishment of the guillotine. The members of the Assembly withdrew, leaving the hall in possession of the mob. As soon as the fact of the crime committed against the National Assembly was known in Paris, about 4 o'clock, the rappel was beaten in all the legions. The National Guard immediately assembled with admirable ardor to cries of Vive l'Assemblée Nationale. The 10th and 3rd Legions went towards the National Assembly to protect it. Several representatives joined their ranks, asking for arms. The other legions, detachments of the Garde Mobile, detachments of infantry and cavalry, and a battery of artillery, went to the Hôtel de Ville to possess themselves of the 2 or 3 provisional governments who had installed themselves therein. M. de Lamartine and M. Ledru-Rollin were on horseback, side by side, in the ranks of the 2nd Legion. Everywhere on their passage they were received with acclamation and by the cry of Vive l'Assemblée Nationale. On arriving at the Hôtel de Ville, they entered it without resistance. They found about 100 individuals assembled, the greatest number of whom were arrested, the rest escaping. No act of violence had to be deplored. M. de Lamartine and M. Ledru-Rollin left the Hôtel de Ville at 7 o'clock, they were both on horseback, and proceeded to the National Assembly. The immense and compact crowd scarcely allowed their horses to advance. They were almost borne by thousands of arms. Unanimous cries broke out on their passage. M. de Lamartine, with his arms extended and shaking hands with thousands, with tears in his eyes, addressed thanks to the multitude of devoted citizens. This demonstration accompanied him to the palace of the National Assembly. Between 6 and 7 o'clock, the legions of the banlieue entered Paris, by all the barriers, to offer their support to the National Assembly and their cooperation to the Executive Commission. At 6 o'clock, Barbès was at the Hôtel de Ville, drawing up a proclamation which was to be printed, and by which the different administrations were distributed among his friends, when 2 captains and about 10 National Guards of the 3rd and 6th Legions entered the salle. "Barbès! Where is Barbès? We must have him," was their first cry. "No, no, to arms!" cried some men with red belts. "You shall march over our dead bodies sooner than have him." A greater number of National Guards then entered and endeavored to go into the salle occupied by 3 members of the Provisional Government. The sentinels posted by Barbès offered great resistance. A deputy mayor of Paris then came up. There were cries of "Vive Lamartine," Monsieur Lamartine having then arrived, and he was borne in triumph into the Hôtel de Ville and could only say a few words, which were received with noisy acclamations. The 5th and 7th batteries of the artillery of the National Guard, headed by their chef d'escadron, made a line in the passage leading to the place occupied by Barbès, Albert, Thor, and others. Shortly after 7 o'clock, the following was issued. Quote, "The Hôtel de Ville is delivered. The Provisional Government is leaving it amidst the acclamations of the people. The conspirators have been arrested. Citizen Wvthcomp, bearer of the present proclamation, is charged to read and cause it to be placarded in all the mayories of Paris. Flottard, Secretary General of the Mairie of Paris. May 15, 7 o'clock in the evening." End quote. At 8 o'clock, the following proclamation was issued from the Hôtel de Ville. Quote, "French Republic. Liberty, equality, fraternity. The National Assembly is not dissolved. The President, yielding to the tumult, declared the sitting at an end. The brave citizens of Paris are called on to maintain the respect due to the National Assembly, which was elected by universal suffrage. To attack the National Assembly is to attack the Republic conquered in February and proclaimed by the Assembly. Vive l'Assemblée nationale! Vive la République! Armand Marat, representative of the people, Mayor of Paris." End quote. Thus the fidelity of the Guards and the firmness of the government averted the crisis. The plot was widely ramified, and parties high in office were implicated. The government did not deem it prudent to proceed against all the delinquents, but most of the leading desperadoes were committed prisoners to the castle of Vincennes, among whom were M. Barbès, a man of fortune and highly educated, M. Raspail, a distinguished chemist, and M. Blanqui, a gentleman of ancient family and of high acquirements and talents. Paris had scarcely subsided into quiet after these terrible commotions and alarms, when the inhabitants were summoned by the government to a great national fête of Concorde, which took place on Sunday, the 21st of May. A procession was formed from the Place de la Concorde to the Champ de Mars. In the evening all Paris was brilliantly illuminated. The Champ de Mars, Champs-Élysées, and the Tuileries were lighted by 500,000 of lamps aided by 10,000 Chinese lanterns. The most perfect order was everywhere preserved, and no accident occurred to disturb the festivity. It was supposed that 1,200,000 persons participated in the fête, and more than 10 millions of francs were distributed among the vendors of refreshments. Even the illumination was estimated at a cost of upwards of 200,000 francs. Immediately after the Fête de la Concorde, the National Assembly resumed its labors of legislation and oratory. On the 24th of May, the Orléans Family Banishment Bill, which had been referred to a committee and unanimously approved of by them, was brought up. Letters of protest were read from the Duc d'Aumale, Prince de Joinville, and the Duc de Nemours, denominated in the proceedings as François, Henri, and Louis d'Orléans, against the decree of banishment. A declaration was unanimously adopted by the Assembly as an instruction to the executive government to this effect, quote, "A fraternal compact with Germany, the reconstruction of an independent and free Poland, and the emancipation of Italy." End quote. Decrees were signed by the Executive Commission dissolving the clubs of which Barbès and Blanqui were presidents. An unusual display of military precaution was manifested around the chamber. The entire line of the quays on the south bank adjoining the chamber was occupied by bodies of troops, horse and foot. The quays on the opposite side, extending from the bridge in either direction, were occupied by battalions of the Garde Mobile. The precincts of the Legislative Palace literally swarmed with soldiers, consisting of infantry of the line, cavalry, and artillery. Artillerymen stood ready, mounted on the horses harnessed to the ammunition wagons in the court. These important preparations were taken on account of the debate appointed for Italy and Poland, the topics which had served as a pretext for the outrage of the 5th. The reports which were circulated of another popular manifestation determined the President of the Assembly to transfer to General Cavaignac, the Minister of War, the full command of all the troops, as well within as without the Palace of the Assembly. End of section 80. Section 81 of History of the Revolutions in Europe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark DeSanzo. History of the Revolutions in Europe by Christoph Koch, translated by Maximilian Schul. French Revolution of February 1848, Part 4. For the whole week, Paris continued in a state of alarm. It was found absolutely necessary, from the condition of the public finances, to put a stop to employing laborers at the public expense, and the measures necessary to that end alarmed the workmen and excited them against the government. To abolish at once the ateliers nationaux was thought impossible and inhuman, but all parties proclaimed the necessity of stopping the evil. The Minister of Public Works issued a proclamation in which he distinctly stated that the government was occupied in preparing for the organization of the national workshops. At an early hour of Monday the 29th, the rappel was beaten in 5 or 6 arrondissements, and great numbers of the National Guard immediately turned out in arms. By 8 o'clock, several thousand of them were assembled at the different rendezvous. They were then marched to the National Assembly, the Garden of the Tuileries, the Luxembourg, the Hôtel de Ville, and other places. The different ministries were also strongly guarded. At the National Assembly the force was immense, not only of National Guards, but of troops of the line. The quays, the Pont de la Concorde, and, in fact, all the approaches to the Assembly were strongly guarded. The occasion of this overwhelming display of bayonets was the fear of a threatening demonstration against the Assembly and the executive government. Affairs continued in this state for many days, when the election of Louis Napoleon as representative of Paris for the vacancy caused by the double returns of the original elections led to a demonstration of a more serious kind. His popularity seemed great, and he was not only elected for Paris, but for 3 departments wherein vacancies had occurred from a similar cause. On the following Sunday his name was to be heard in all the assemblies of the holy-day people of the lower class outside the barriers of Paris. On Monday morning a new journal appeared, entitled Le Napoléonien, the Advocate of the Prince, and its first number displaying considerable ability. Crowds collected in the quarters leading to the National Assembly. Troops and National Guards were called out, and amid much excitement, because M. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was expected to take his seat in the National Assembly. During the day a placard appeared, bearing an address of General Piat, colonel of the 4th Legion of National Guards, he who had taken possession of the Hôtel de Ville on the 24th February, in which he, as an avowed friend of Prince Louis Napoleon, disclaimed for him any ambitious project. Other friends of the prince in the country were not, however, equally discreet. They carried their ballot in front of their hats, on which was inscribed, in large characters, Louis Napoleon, vive l'Empereur, abat la République. About 5 o'clock in the evening, the government ordered strong measures against the crowds assembled in the Place de la Révolution. Regiments of infantry and cavalry and large bodies of National Guards immediately crossed the bridge in front of the Palace of the Assembly, and forming a junction with those already on the place, cleared it, at the point of the bayonet, of the immense assemblage that had occupied it, in 5 minutes. Complaints were made of unnecessary violence on the part of the armed force in carrying out this order of the government, conveyed through the Minister of War, under whose eye the service was performed. But, as matters had come to something like a crisis, no hesitation was allowed when the command "withdraw" was issued. Having cleared the place, a column of at least 2,000 Gardes Mobiles wheeled up to the Rue de Rivoli and formed about 20 abreast. The order was given to march. The drums beat a charge, and the column moved at double-quick time along the Rue de Rivoli and through the Rue Castiglione and La Paix. Having reached the boulevard, they proceeded in the same order and at the same pace to the hotel of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and there halted. In the meanwhile, the dragoons advanced from the Place de la Révolution by the Rue Royale, driving the people before them who did not comply silently, for cries of "Vive l'Empereur! Vive Louis Napoleon!" were shouted by them vigorously. The boulevard cleared, the dragoons remained in position. The whole of the Rue Royale was filled with National Guards. Access to the Place de la Révolution was refused to everybody. This continued for an hour or two. Ultimately, the people retired after venting their displeasure in shouting. Later in the evening, other assemblages that took place were dispersed without much trouble. In the assembly itself, the greatest excitement prevailed. M. de Lamartine took advantage of the panic and proposed that the laws of 1816 and 1832, forbidding the entry of the Bonaparte family into France, should be enforced against the pretender. The motion was received amid deafening shouts of "Vive la République." The recent election of M. Thiers, former minister of Louis Philippe, was still another source of popular excitement and jealousy, and everything had indicated growing restlessness and discontent. The government, finding the burden imposed on the public treasury too heavy to be borne, had determined on sending out of Paris to the provinces about 12,000 of the workmen in the national workshops. This was a signal of alarm, and on the 22nd of June, a body of about 400 went in procession to the provisional government for the purpose of remonstrance. M. Marie, in behalf of the government, consented to receive 5 of them. To one of these, who had been an active party in the affair of the 15th of May, he refused to listen, and addressing the others, said, quote, "You are not the slaves of that man. You can state your own grievances." End quote. He heard them with attention, but failed to satisfy them with the course that had been adopted. On returning to their companions, they distorted M. Marie's expression, and said that they had been called slaves. The mob then cried, "Down with Marie! Down with the Executive Committee! Down with the National Assembly!" In the evening, they stationed themselves in the Place de la Bastille and at the Barrière de Trône. Barricades were formed at the Porte Saint-Denis and Porte Saint-Martin. The environs of the Hôtel de Ville, of the Luxembourg, the Boulevard, and the quarters of Saint-Martin, Saint-Denis, and Le Temple were all thronged with multitudes of operatives. At 8 o'clock, the square of the Panthéon was filled with several thousands, who marched with banners to the Faubourg du Temple, where they were joined by large bodies of working men. Measures of precaution were taken during the evening. The National Guard were called out. Numerous detachments of troops were stationed at the Luxembourg. At 10 o'clock, a squadron of dragoons and several companies of the troops of the line bivouacked on the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville. At 11 o'clock, the battalion of the line took possession of the court of the Prefecture of Police. The peristyle of the Palais de Justice was guarded by the Garde Mobile. The assembly was filled with troops. Everywhere the armed force was very numerous. The insurgents, in the course of Friday morning, threw up barricades in various quarters on both banks of the Seine, and at noon was to be seen in all directions the formidable nature of the preparations which they had made for the coming contest. Their plan displayed great strategic skill and correct judgment. The insurrection extended on the right bank from the Faubourg Poissonnière to the Seine, embracing thus the whole Faubourg Saint-Antoine. On the left bank it occupied the Faubourg Saint-Marcel, Saint-Victor, and the lower part of the Quartier Saint-Jacques. These two positions were connected by the occupation of many points, such as the Church of Saint-Gervais, a part of the Quartier du Temple, the approaches of Notre Dame, and the Pont Saint-Michel. The Church of Saint-Séverin served as headquarters, and the Faubourg Saint-Antoine as a magazine. This plan was ingeniously conceived, for the insurgents were thus masters of an immense semicircle, which formed nearly 1/2 of Paris. In case of check, the nature of the houses and the narrow streets created difficulties almost insurmountable to the troops, and afforded certain chances to the insurgents of retreat. In case of success, it was easy for the insurgents, by advancing a little, to occupy the important lines of the quays and boulevards, and they could surround by degrees the Hôtel de Ville, which would have been thus in their power, and once masters of that and the prefecture, they could have established their government. The measures taken by the authorities cost a great number of lives, but that sad result was inevitable from the savage energy with which the insurgents defended themselves. Across the boulevard and quite close to the Porte Saint-Denis was an immense barricade formed of 4 or 5 omnibuses, several carriages, a huge wagon, and paving stones taken from the streets, which were torn up for a considerable distance on both sides. A little beyond the Rue Saint-Denis was another barricade, as formidable as the first and composed of much the same miscellaneous materials. And still further on, towards the Porte Saint-Martin, was a third barricade, not quite so large as the first, but still sufficient to be a powerful defense against a coup de main. The end of the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Denis was also closed up with a huge barricade, which prevented the approach of troops from the outskirts. The Rue Saint-Denis, the Rue Villeneuve-Bourbon, the Rue de Cléry, and the other streets abutting on the spot in possession of the conspirators were similarly defended, and thousands of gamins were industriously working with pikes and spades, tearing up the streets and adding to the defenses. The barricades were defended by some hundreds of the people in blues, of whom many were not armed, or at least did not show their arms. They had a great number of tricolored flags stuck upon the top of the barricades, with the words Ateliers Nationaux inscribed upon them. The Porte Saint-Denis, which was in the hands of the conspirators, was decorated with a black flag, and on the top of it were arranged heaps of paving stones, apparently for the purpose of being hurled upon the heads of those who might attack it. The insurgents having been called upon, without effect, to surrender, the engagement commenced and lasted 20 minutes. To the platoons of the infantry, the rioters responded with a sharp fire, not only from the barricades, but from the neighboring streets. At length the barricades were taken, but not until the troops had sustained a severe loss. The commanding officer of the National Guard was mortally wounded, and many men and officers of the Garde Mobile and regular army were killed. Discharges of musketry were heard throughout the night, and nothing could exceed the alarm everywhere prevailing. About 1 o'clock on Saturday, notice was given by the National Assembly that Paris was in a state of siege, and General Cavaignac was declared commander of the whole military force. After this decree was passed, the Executive Council addressed the following communication to the President of the Assembly. Quote, Citizen President, the Executive Committee would think it was wanting alike in its duty and honor if it withdrew before sedition and a public peril. It withdraws only a vote of the Assembly. In remitting to it the power with which it invested us, we return to the ranks of the National Assembly to devote ourselves with you to the common danger and to the safety of the Republic. Lamartine, Arago, Ledru-Rollin, Garnier-Pagès, Marie, members of the Executive Committee, 24th June, Panier, Secretary, end quote. One of the first orders of General Cavaignac, after the capital was declared in a state of siege, was that the troops of the line and the Garde Mobile should fight, and that the National Guard should guard the streets, prevent the assembling of crowds, and watch over the preservation of private property. The plan was an excellent one. It completely stopped all assistance being sent to the insurgents. Every person not on duty as a National Guard was searched, his residence asked, and he was led by a National Guard to his own door. No one was allowed to move out without a passport, and even business was not taken for an excuse for being out in these terrible times. Many curious discoveries were made in consequence of this arrangement. In the Rue d'Elde and in the neighborhood of Notre-Dame-de-Lorette, well-dressed females were detected carrying ball cartridges in their baskets. A man feigning to be wounded was carried on a mattress which was filled with gunpowder and ball, and some hearses were seized which contained powder and ball. Although the fight was resumed in various quarters at daybreak on Saturday morning, the severest struggle took place in the districts of the Cité and Saint-Jacques. From 1 o'clock a.m. until 4 o'clock p.m., the fusillade and cannonade continued incessantly. The insurgents had 13 pieces of cannon. 3 were taken. About 9:30, the insurgents, who were surrounded on almost all points, succeeded in forcing a passage by means of their artillery. About 10 o'clock, this column was in the quarter of the Halles, where a bloody encounter took place. At the same hour, the insurgents of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine were marching to operate in junction with the column of Saint-Jacques, and an armistice until 11 o'clock was proposed by General Cavaignac, who declared that after that hour the most energetic terms would be adopted. They refused to surrender, and the combat was resumed. Shot and shell were used against the insurgents, the center of whose operations was at the church of Saint-Séverin. The battle raged without cessation the whole day in this quarter, and thousands, it was computed, fell on both sides. At 3:30 p.m. the insurgents were driven to the Panthéon and there surrounded. They fought desperately and with a courage which would be admirable if devoted to a just cause, and at 5 o'clock the Panthéon was recovered from them after 300 discharges of cannon. In the course of the day, Saturday, the Archbishop of Paris received a wound in the groin, which resulted in his death. The venerable priest having offered General Cavaignac to go on a mission of conciliation to the insurgents, the offer was at once accepted, and 3 members of the National Assembly, Messieurs Larrabee, Gailly-Cazalet, and Drouet-Devaux, volunteered to accompany him. On their arrival at the entry to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the Archbishop and his companions advanced to speak to them. They were crossing the formidable barricade at the entrance to the faubourg, when unfortunately the beat of a drum alarmed the insurgents. Shots were discharged on both sides, and unhappily one of the balls struck the Archbishop, who immediately fell. Some of the insurgents went immediately to the assistance of the venerable prelate, who was carried to the hospital of 15-20. The insurgents denied that the fatal shot came from their side. The situation of Paris on Saturday night was still very alarming. Though the insurgents had been driven from their position on the left bank of the Seine, and that part of the city was quite free from them, being held by strong patrols of troops, National Guards, and mobiles, they were posted with great force at various points on the right bank, from which the troops had been unable to dislodge them, notwithstanding the most vigorous and repeated assaults, in the course of which great loss of life occurred. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine and Faubourg du Temple toward the east, and the Clos Saint-Lazare on the north side of town formed their strongholds in this direction. At an early hour on Sunday, the attack was again commenced. During the day, some attempts were made to erect barricades on the left bank of the Seine, but they were instantly destroyed by the National Guard and the troops of the line. Before night, the insurgents here were entirely dispersed, with the exception of a few isolated parties, who still held out in the most remote part of the great Faubourg Saint-Marceau, and who would have surrendered before, but that a rumor had got among them that no quarter was to be given. In the whole of that district, however, the danger was at an end, and there was not the slightest appearance of a fresh insurrection. The island of Saint-Louis, which had been for some time in the hands of the insurgents, was also retaken. On the right bank, the insurgents were driven from the formidable Clos Saint-Lazare after a murderous struggle, in which a vast number of lives were sacrificed on both sides and dislodged, also from all the positions which they occupied in the Rue Saint-Antoine and in the streets between the Hôtel de Ville and the basin of the Canal Saint-Martin. The National Guard and the troops occupied the whole of the line of the canal from the Place de la Bastille to the district called the Chapelle Saint-Denis, which last place was taken at a late hour after a murderous struggle. General Duvivier had formed a junction with General Lamoricière, who commanded the troops in the north of Paris and who had succeeded in taking the Clos Saint-Lazare. The insurrection was thus driven from the heart of Paris, which it had occupied hitherto. At 9 o'clock on Sunday night, orders were given that all the shutters of the windows of all the houses should be thrown and left open, as several National Guards and soldiers had been killed by shots fired within the houses by men concealed behind them. Up to this period of the conflict, it was estimated that the number of troops, National Guards, and Garde Mobile killed and wounded was upwards of 15,000. On the side of the insurgents, the casualties were not so numerous. On Monday morning an armistice took place, when the insurgents sent a deputation to propose a surrender on the condition that they should be allowed to retain their arms. This proposal was at once rejected by General Cavaignac, who insisted on an unconditional surrender, and allowed the insurgents till 10 o'clock to determine what they should do. At that hour it was thought that the terms proposed were agreed to, but some of the government troops having got within the lines of the insurgents were fired at, and a great number of them were killed. Hostilities immediately recommenced, which, after a short contest, was brought to an end by the unconditional surrender of the insurgents, who themselves assisted in pulling down their barricades. During the conflict on Sunday and Monday, it should be mentioned, the National Guards from the departments near Paris, particularly Rouen, Amiens, Orléans, etc., fought gallantly by the side of their Paris brethren. Monday night passed without the slightest disturbance or appearance of an intention on the part of the insurgents to renew the contest. After 1 o'clock in the day there was no fighting, but it was not until 25 minutes to 10 o'clock at night that Monsieur Sénart, the President of the National Assembly, announced that all was terminated, that the barricades had been taken down, and that nothing remained excepting the agitation which was inseparable from such events. A great number of the insurgents had laid down their arms, but by far the greater number of them had taken refuge in the country between Vincennes and Saint-Denis, where they were pursued by several regiments of cavalry and infantry. In the course of Monday evening, 1,500 took up their quarters in the cemetery of Père-Lachaise, but on an alarm that troops were coming, they retreated to the neighborhood of Romainville. The total number who had fled to the country amounted to several thousands. The number of prisoners already made was very great. The prisons were filled with them, and every hour added to the number. On Monday night 500 prisoners, who had surrendered in the Faubourg du Temple, were marched along the boulevard, strongly guarded by infantry, and carried to one of the detached forts in the neighborhood of Paris. They consisted principally of ouvriers, but several of them were dressed in the uniform of National Guards, and a considerable number in that of the Garde Républicaine. And on the same evening the whole of the city was illuminated, not so much as a token of rejoicing for the victory gained, as to enable the sentries to distinguish each other, and to prevent any further attempt upon the part of the insurgents. The insurgents had resolved to defend themselves to the last, and had posted up a printed proclamation in the streets, declaring that they would bury themselves under the ruins rather than surrender, except on their own terms. They had cannon of large dimensions, from which they poured a murderous fire upon the troops, and they only gave way when they found that the howitzers were rapidly thinning their ranks. They then began to fly in every direction, many of them abandoning their muskets. But the exasperation of the troops of the line and the artillery of the National Guard was such that it was impossible to prevent a considerable massacre among the insurgents. A great number, however, were made prisoners, and the armed fugitives, who in their flight frequently turned round to continue the attack, were pursued by a division of the artillery of the National Guard to a considerable distance. The insurrection was by far the most terrible that has ever desolated Paris. The number of killed and wounded will probably never be known, but certainly amounts to many thousands. Many calculate the number as high as 20,000, and none estimate it below 10,000. The troops of the line suffered greatly, and of the Garde Mobile, nearly 1/3 were either killed or wounded. General Cavaignac, having fulfilled the purpose for which the dictatorial power had been confided to him, resigned it to the Assembly and issued the following proclamation to the National Guard and the army. Quote, "Citizen soldiers, the sacred cause of the Republic has triumphed. Your devotedness and unshakable courage have baffled guilty projects and done justice on fatal errors. In the name of the country, in the name of all humanity, be thanked for your efforts, be blessed for this necessary triumph. This morning the emotion of the struggle was legitimate, inevitable, but at present be as great and calm as you have just been in the combat. In Paris I see victors and vanquished, but may my name be accursed if I should consent to see victims. Justice will take its course, let it act, this is your wish and it is mine also. Ready to return to the rank of simple citizen, I will carry in the midst of you the remembrance of having, in these grave trials, only taken from liberty what the safety of the Republic itself demanded, and of leaving an example to whoever may be in his turn called on to fulfill such great duties." End quote. The Assembly then passed a vote of thanks to him and his associates, and unanimously yielded to him the chief executive authority, with the power of electing his ministers. The council, formed accordingly, was ultimately composed of the following members: General Cavaignac, President; Monsieur Marie, Minister of Justice; Monsieur Bastide, Minister of Foreign Affairs; Monsieur Sénart, Minister of the Interior; General Lamoricière, Minister of War; Monsieur de Verinac, Minister of Marine; Monsieur Goudchot, Minister of Finance; Monsieur Ricoeur, Minister of Public Works; Monsieur Torre, Minister of Commerce; Monsieur Vaux-Labelle, Minister of Public Construction. General Chargarnier was appointed Commander of the National Guard at Paris. The ministry is, for the most part, composed of men whose talents and character inspire respect. General Cavaignac himself is considered a sincere Republican, an honest, unambitious, and able man, one who will seek in the unexampled crisis of the affairs of his country not to promote his own personal aggrandizement or private interests, but to advance the public good, the welfare of the nation. His treatment of the vanquished has elicited universal admiration, and his administration thus far has been distinguished by judgment, energy, and resolution. End of section 81. Section 82 of History of the Revolutions in Europe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark DeSanzo. Revolutions in Europe by Christoph Koch, translated by Maximilian Schull. Revolutions in Germany in 1848. Part 1. The large number of independent states of which the United Confederation is formed renders a condensed account of the great revolutions that have taken place in them a matter of difficulty. They are no less than 37 in number, many of them being very small, but each possessing an independent government and only liable to be called upon to furnish a proportionate contingent to the army of the Confederation in case of danger. For hundreds of years, the desire for the union of Germany into one great federal empire has existed in the minds and hearts of many patriotic men in Germany, and the establishment of the great Zollverein, or customs union, was hailed with joy as one of the means by which this object might be accomplished. With the exception of Austria, Hanover, Hamburg, and Mecklenburg-Schwerin, all the states of the Confederation immediately joined the union. In the west and north of Germany, poverty had been making alarming inroads since 1840, notwithstanding the employment afforded by the artificial birth and protection of factories and mills. The still more rapidly increasing population, with its intelligence, forced men to think on these matters, and very soon did they arrive at the conclusion that their government increased their evils, without attempting to alleviate them. They recognized in the government of Austria an open despotism. They saw through the pretexts of constitutional liberty with which Frederick William of Prussia sought to hide the despotic tendencies of his mind. They learned to despise the disgraceful profligacy of King Ludwig of Bavaria. They discovered the petty tyrannies practiced by the smaller princes and electors of Germany, and their minds awakened to a just sense of their rights and privileges as men as well as subjects. Silently, these impressions were circulated throughout the different states. In Baden, M.M. Welcker and Bassermann openly called for a constitutional government and freedom of the press. The time for action was approaching. Men understood that it was necessary and were beginning to measure their strength when suddenly the fire of the French Revolution of February 1848 inflamed all Europe. Its sparks, flying in all directions, kindled the train in preparation throughout Germany, and immediately the whole country was in a blaze. Popular commotions took place in all the large cities, and the cry was for a political constitution which should give the people a share in legislation, establish the liberty of the press, abolish odious restrictions, reform the judicial system, and otherwise extend popular rights. On the 29th of February, 1848, at Karlsruhe in Baden, deputations from every town in the Grand Duchy besieged the Grand Duke, demanding liberty of the press, trial by jury, extended suffrage, constitutional government, institution of a burgher guard, right of public meeting, and amended representation of the German nations in the Diet at Frankfurt. On the 2nd of March, the Grand Duke yielded to the demands of his people, dismissed his obnoxious ministers, and called to his council M. Welcker, for many years the firm and consistent opponent of all the despotic proceedings of the government. Great popular demonstrations were made in favor of similar concessions at Mayence in Hesse-Darmstadt, Hanau in Hesse-Kassel, Wiesbaden in Nassau, Stuttgart in Württemberg, and many smaller towns in those neighborhoods. On the 3rd of March, at Cologne, the people proceeded in a body to the townhouse where the council were sitting, and required of the Prussian authorities their sanction to similar petitions. A riot ensued, the townhouse was stormed, and the authorities made prisoners. The intervention of the military released them, and the governor of the Rhine provinces promised to forward the petitions of the inhabitants to Berlin. On the same day, the inhabitants of Frankfurt met together and added their voices to the almost universal shout for reform, expressing their discontent with the meager concessions which the Diet had that day made. The Diet had abandoned the idea of a universal law of the press for all Germany, and resolved to allow each state to exercise its own judgment in the matter, subject to certain guarantees. The 4th of the month witnessed the bloodless revolution of Munich. On that day the people of Munich assembled together in large numbers in the streets in the neighborhood of the palace and demanded reform. In the excitement of the moment they stormed the arsenal, possessed themselves of the arms it contained, and thus equipped, unchecked by the military, proceeded to the palace, and forced from King Ludwig those concessions which he had refused to make. A week had thus elapsed since the occurrences at Paris, and we find that at its close the demands of the inhabitants of the Kingdom of Bavaria, the Dukedom of Baden, the Kingdom of Württemberg, the Dukedom of Nassau, and the electorate of Hesse-Darmstadt had been conceded by the ruling powers. At Hanau in Hesse-Kassel, an insurrection with barricades and conflicts between a portion of the people and the soldiery were needed before the elector would yield. At the United Diet at Frankfurt, they agreed that their rulers ought to cease to be alone represented at the Diet, and demanded that the people should have their representatives at its sittings. On the 5th of March, 51 representatives of different countries of Prussia, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, and Hesse-Darmstadt met together at Heidelberg to consult on the state of Germany and the steps necessary to be adopted in such a crisis. They unanimously adopted a series of resolutions embodying the following plans: that no war of intervention should be made against the new order of things, that no attempts should be made to deprive other nations of the liberty and independence which they had earned as a right, that a representative assembly should be convened for all German states to avert internal and external dangers and to develop the energy and prosperity of the country, that a body of volunteer representatives should be organized to offer their assistance to government in this matter, and that all Germany should unite to defend the country against foreign aggression. The Diet, then sitting at Frankfurt, on the following day declared its conviction of the necessity of reforming the Federal Diet, and invoked the different German states to send immediately to Frankfurt men enjoying the confidence of their countrymen to assist in the deliberations necessary for a new constitution of the Diet. During this first week of March, matters remained tranquil in the north and south of Germany, though the uneasiness felt by the royal heads and their councillors had very much increased. The agitation of the sturdy inhabitants of the Rhine provinces, and slight symptoms of the same near the capital, induced Prince Frederick William of Prussia on the 6th to promise that he would grant to the assembled states the right conferred by the law of the 3rd of February on the assembled committees of the states to meet periodically at fixed times, and he promised to confirm the privileges of the committees in a corresponding manner. No time, however, was fixed. On the same day, the Prince of Prussia was appointed Governor-General of the Rhine provinces. He did not, however, leave Berlin. Large bodies of troops were moving all this time from the eastern provinces of Prussia to the neighborhood of the Rhine. On the 10th of the month, the King of Prussia issued a decree declaring himself dissatisfied with the resolution of the Diet with respect to the freedom of the press, and announced that, unless the Diet granted substantively the freedom of the press for the whole Confederation, he would take the initiative for the Prussian kingdom at the next meeting. We may here state that on the 14th he issued another decree announcing that, in conjunction with Austria and Saxony, he had accepted the invitation of the Diet to send deputies to Frankfurt for the purpose of deliberating on the reconstruction of the Federal Diet on a more extended basis, and in order that, fundamentally united by strengthened free institutions, Germany might once more become one great country and reassume its ancient grandeur and proper rank in Europe. While King Frederick William was thus engaged in Prussia, his ally in Saxony was undergoing the process of compulsory concession. Dresden and Leipzig pronounced in favor of the universal progress and compelled the king to grant their request. King Ernest Augustus of Hanover, after much temporizing and great delays, which if prolonged another day might have cost him his throne, was compelled on the 16th to grant the demands of the Hanoverians. Long held to be the most politically careless race in Germany, their city, one of the most pleasant in Europe for the resort of foreigners, renowned for its varied attractions, musical, theatrical, and scientific, but regarded as dead to all else, the Viennese nevertheless preceded Berlin in the attainment of the constitutional government. On the 13th of March, the session of the Diet of Lower Austria was opened. An immense concourse of the inhabitants assembled in the neighborhood of the church, headed by the students. They drew up a petition in favor of constitutional government, freedom of the press, national armament, trial by jury, and religious freedom. Having possessed themselves of the Hall of Assembly, Archduke Albert addressed them, assuring the students that their demands should be granted. Notwithstanding this assurance of the Archduke, nothing was done. A decree promulgating freedom of the press was issued but withdrawn within half an hour, and their demands were then refused. Angry and excited, the populace and the students rushed upon the arsenal, obtained arms, and advanced to meet the soldiers, who were ordered to suppress the riot. In various parts of the town barricades were built, and conflicts occurred on the night of the 13th and morning of the 14th. The military made no impression on the rioters, and the government, finding the neighboring countrymen were flocking into the town to assist the insurrectionists, and that portion of the soldiery were also leaving the ranks, felt themselves compelled to succumb. Metternich resigned, the unpopular archdukes, Albert, Ludwig, and William, retired, the demands of the people were granted, a popular ministry installed, and Austria became a constitutional empire on the 15th of March. Metternich fled in disguise, and his palace was burnt. The accounts of the number of the slain during these 2 days vary very much. 150 will be found to be near the truth. One of the results of this change was that Hungary obtained a national government. The Hungarian Chamber had previously remonstrated very strongly against the policy pursued by Metternich, and had demanded the recall of the Austrian authorities and the substitution of Hungarians in their places. On the 13th of March, a monster meeting was held in Berlin to petition the king for the reforms granted in other countries. The meeting, which was rather tumultuous, was dispersed by the soldiery. Blood was shed, and several lives were lost. On the 14th and 15th, similar meetings took place, which were put down in the same way. On the following day, the students of Berlin, united with those of Halle, joined the people in their petitions and threatened to arm unless their petitions were granted. On the 17th, the revolution at Vienna became known at Berlin, and on the morning of the 18th, the king issued that most remarkable decree in which he demanded the union of the whole German Empire, the reorganization of its confederation, the institution of a common government, a common army, and a common customs union, and very plainly intimated his willingness to ascend the imperial throne, acknowledging, as he did, that, in the adoption of this course of proceeding, he had been very materially hastened by the events at Vienna. Though the last German sovereign to grant the demands of his people, he was perfectly ready, now that popularity was necessary to the attainment of his object, to grant some, at least, of the required concessions. He granted liberty of the press, subject to the penal laws for libel, etc., and convoked the Diet for the 2nd of April. Slight as were these concessions, the great aspirations of His Majesty were very popular apparently, and in the afternoon of the same day the people assembled in the square in front of the palace to thank the king and cheer him, when by an unaccountable accident suddenly 2 shots were fired, and the people were immediately charged by the infantry and cavalry, with whom the palace and its courts were filled. Many lives were lost, and the people fled in all directions. Barricades were erected, the gun shops sacked, and the people armed. All that afternoon and the following night did the battle rage with the utmost vehemence. In the morning, though apparently successful, the troops were utterly worn out with fatigue, and their general being in the hands of the people, a prisoner, the king capitulated, ordered all the troops to leave the town, permitted the establishment of the burgher guard, granted universal suffrage, dismissed his hated ministers, Bodelschwingh, Thiele, and Eichhorn, and nominated Count Arnim president of the council, with Count Schwerin and M. Auerswald, all liberals, as his assistants. On the morning of the 19th, a royal proclamation appeared, declaring that the revolution had been caused by evil-minded foreigners, and that his troops did not use their weapons until forced to do so to defend themselves. On Sunday morning His Majesty was forced to appear on the balcony to see 37 dead bodies, the victims either of a blunder or an unfortunate treachery. Of the people, nearly 240 fell during the fight. The number of soldiers killed is not known, but is conjectured to be near 700 or 800. Of course, very many died of their wounds subsequently. On the 20th, a political amnesty was declared, and M. Camphausen summoned to assist in the ministry. During the conflict, the Prince of Prussia, who was very obnoxious to the people, remained hidden in the palace. He subsequently left Berlin disguised and fled to England. On the 21st, King Frederick William annihilated the Kingdom of Prussia in a proclamation and declared his intention of once more uniting Germany and taking it under his guidance in these moments of peril and anarchy. Prussia was to be merged into Germany. Constitutional government, equal political and civil rights, popular and liberal administrations were the order of the day. This proclamation was received with enthusiasm, and on the following day the king rode through Berlin wearing the German national colors, escorted by half the population, the blood of the slain subjects hardly dried in the streets, and their bodies lying in state in all the churches. On that occasion His Majesty swore that he did not intend to dethrone any one German prince, that he did not wish for the imperial crown, and only wanted liberty, union, and good order in Germany. To assist in the ministerial deliberations on the new constitution, Professor Dollmann, the well-known historian and tried friend of liberty, was summoned to Berlin. While matters were proceeding thus in the capital of Prussia, King Ludwig of Bavaria suddenly abdicated the throne in favor of his son Maximilian. On the 22nd, the new king opened the chambers in person, and in a gracious speech from the throne announced his intention of perfecting the concessions granted by his father. End of section 82. Section 83 of History of the Revolutions in Europe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark DeSanzo. History of the Revolutions in Europe by Christoph de Koch, translated by Maximilian Schull. Revolutions in Germany in 1848, Part 2. In Austria, matters were steadily progressing. The ministry, employed in securing by law the liberal concessions, were assisted by 12 members of the Diet and 12 citizens. The secret police was abolished, freedom of the press being considered a guarantee against treasonable associations. A political amnesty was pronounced, and nearly 200 political prisoners were released. At Pressburg, the capital of Hungary, great dissatisfaction was expressed at 2 decrees which placed the control of the government somewhat in the hands of Vienna. In the National Assembly, violent speeches were made, and the 2 imperial commissioners were burnt in effigy in the streets. The Bohemians being also at this time much agitated, Baron Pillersdorf promised them that all their demands should be granted, that they should have their national representatives, a national guard, and that their own language should be used. On the 6th April, the ministry at Vienna underwent another change. Archduke Ludwig, Kolerath, and Kubeck, who were suspected of reactionary designs, resigned office and were succeeded by Archduke John, M. Fickelmau, and Kraus, with Marshal Zanini for Minister of War. Hungary continued much agitated, and Bohemia was in open rebellion, 2 or 3 of the magnates or princes setting themselves up for kings. Vienna, during the whole of April and May, may be said to have been under the rule of the mob, guided by the students. On the 10th, serious disturbances occurred. Fickelmau was forced to resign, and was succeeded by Baron Cesalini. On the 18th of May, the emperor left Vienna, and by a party of his friends, anxious for his personal safety, was conveyed to Innsbruck in the Tyrol. After his arrival at Innsbruck, he issued a proclamation in which he promised to confirm his concessions in March, and offered to return to Vienna when order and tranquillity should be restored. On the 27th of May, fresh disturbances occurred at Vienna, in consequence of an order from the Minister of the Interior to the Students' Legion to disband. Barricades were built, and after a short conflict the students were victorious. Baron Pillersdorf then ratified the wishes of the citizens and students, declared them independent of every other authority, and answerable for the public safety. Vienna then became tranquil, and the elections to the new assembly proceeded quietly. Croatia, Slavonia, and Dalmatia openly revolted, and proclaimed their intention of founding a Slavonic empire, while Hungary, having been fraternally addressed by the emperor in proclamations and decrees, and its demands having been granted, remained tolerably quiet and loyal, the emperor promising to visit Pressburg and Pest. In Bohemia, events were rapidly hurrying to a crisis. The hatred of the Austrian government was as deep as it was of old standing. The weak and vacillating conduct of the Austrian government, The infectious triumphs of the people at Vienna fanned the love of insurrection, and on the 29th of May a provisional government was proclaimed at Prague, independent of Vienna, with Count Leo Thun at its head. Immediately after its establishment, the provisional government opened a communication with Vienna, and a perfect conflict of protocols ensued, which lasted more than a week. Irritated at the triumphs and determination of the Bohemians, preparations were made on the 12th June by the Austrian commander in Prague, Count Windischgrätz, to remove some of the cannon and other military stores to the neighboring hills which commanded the city, when the inhabitants opposed this proceeding by force. A most fearful and bloody contest ensued, which lasted until the 15th, when, finding the troops unable to sustain the fight in the narrow streets of the city, Count Windischgrätz drew off his troops and on the 2 following days bombarded the town from the neighboring heights. On the evening of the 17th, 13 of the insurrectionary leaders surrendered, and the town once more was in the hands of the Austrians. The number of the slain has not been accurately ascertained, but was very great. Berlin, in the days immediately after the Revolution, quietly witnessed the change of ministry, and listening to the promises that were made, on the 22nd the inhabitants commenced assembling in moderate meetings to discuss the social question of the day, viz., the want of regular, well-paid employment. They ended in demanding the formation of a ministry for the administration of labor. On the 24th, the king promised the national organization of Posen, and immediately appointed a committee, half Germans and half Poles, to confer with his commissioner, Count Wilhelm, on the necessary proceedings to be adopted. This proceeding was regarded with much dissatisfaction by the German inhabitants, who, inimical towards the Poles, composed the larger number of the inhabitants. On the 28th of March a new ministry entered office. Counts Arnhem and Schwerin retired, and their places were filled by Messrs. Camphausen, Hausmann, Bornmann, Auerswald, men of the most radical character. Their first step in office was to procure from His Majesty a decree placing the whole public business in their hands, and rendering them responsible for its conduct. On the 3rd of April the Diet was opened, and for the first time were its sittings open to the press and the public. Ministers were well received. Great difficulty was experienced by the authorities in employing the people out of work. Large public works were planned and immediately commenced, and the poorer classes in the town were sent to cleanse the dirty streets. The Diet occupied itself in discussing a project for a new law of elections for the Assembly to be convoked for the consideration of the Prussian Constitution. The elections were to be indirect. Every 500 inhabitants of the age of 24 were to elect one elector, and 80 of these electors were to elect the deputy. Everyone was qualified to vote at the age of 24 and to be elected at the age of 30. About 350 members were to be thus elected, and so their assembly would meet as one chamber. Those laws were adopted by large majorities. The alarming condition of the province of Posen at this time attracted much attention. The concessions made to the Poles by the king had very much alarmed the German inhabitants, more particularly the peasants. Several bloody engagements took place, in the earlier of which the Poles, under Mieroslavsky, obtained the most decisive advantages. But on the 6th of May a general engagement ensued in the neighborhood of Ziansk, in which Mieroslavsky was defeated and made prisoner. The routed Poles were pursued and dispersed on all sides. The insurrection was completely quelled, and General Kolum having been withdrawn, General Pfuhl, the president of the province, by conciliatory but determined measures, succeeded in quelling the turbulent spirits. The Assembly at Frankfurt has since rejected a proposition for the independence of Posen. The sending away of some arms from the arsenal on the 30th of May excited the students and the people. The boats were stopped, the cases opened, and the contents divided among the actors in this scene. The turbulent excitement of the people increased day by day. They demanded that the working classes should be armed. This was partially conceded, and they were pacified. On the 6th, the Prince of Prussia arrived in Berlin, and took his seat in the Assembly on the 8th. His reception was anything but favorable. Angry dissatisfaction was excited out of doors by the successive emotion in the Assembly that the revolution should not be acknowledged. The ministerial crisis existed until M. Camphausen resigned, his successor being M. Auerswald, one of his colleagues. The present ministry is regarded as rather democratic. It has need of wisdom, courage, and determination, for the same causes which affected the fearful events in Paris are at work in Berlin and elsewhere. Foresight and prudence may prevent an outbreak, but men are beginning to dread its occurrence. As the Germanic Parliament took a very active part in supporting the war in Schleswig-Holstein, it will be well to narrate the proceedings of that body before the events of the war. The Assembly of Deputies from all the states of Germany, who were appointed to make arrangements for the convocation of a German Parliament, was constituted on the 31st of March. After a preliminary meeting, the plan for the election of the German Parliament was proposed, based upon universal suffrage without consideration of property, class, or religious creed. The Assembly resolved at its first meeting to recognize Schleswig-Holstein and urged upon the federal states of the Empire, particularly Prussia, the necessity of assisting the duchies in their endeavors to maintain their independence. They also decided upon the incorporation of the province of Posen in the Diet, as well as East and West Prussia. During the sittings of this assembly, the Republican party made several attempts to procure the recognition of Republican principles, but they were completely defeated, the assembly declaring that the Constitution of Germany could alone be remodeled upon the broadest constitutional monarchical basis. They held their last sitting on the 7th of April and then dissolved, leaving a committee on permanence to keep the Diet which still existed up to the proper mark and to discuss the question of the new German Constitution. On the 27th, this committee completed their labors and presented the Diet their project for a constitution, which was drawn up by the celebrated Dalban. It proposed that all the states hitherto belonging to the Confederation should form one empire with their separate independence somewhat limited, that the government of the empire should represent Germany or any particular state in foreign affairs and manage all diplomatic matters, determine upon peace or war, control the army and navy, the customs, canals, railways and telegraphs, all legislation, and dispose of all customs and postage revenues. The power of the empire to be united in the emperor, the imperial upper and imperial lower house. The upper house to consist of 200 members, viz. All the reigning princes, a deputy from each of the 4 free towns, peers to be chosen, half by the parliaments and half by the reigning princes, for a term of 12 years, 1/3 withdrawing at the end of every 4 years. The lower house to consist of representatives of the people, 1 for every 100,000 souls. The Parliament to meet once a year at Frankfurt, and the lower house to have the control of the budget, similarly to the English House of Commons. A Supreme Court of Justice to be instituted at Nuremberg to decide all disputes between reigning princes, or against any one of them, and all charges of high treason. On the 18th of May, the German Parliament met for the first time at Frankfurt. 397 members were present. M. von Gagern, the monarchist candidate for the presidency, was elected by a majority of 280 votes. The first sittings were occupied by questions of form and in settling something like standing orders. Frequent attempts, however, were made by the Republicans to procure a republic in Germany, and though some differed as to the form of government, all were agreed on the question of its union into one great confederation. They appointed a committee to consider the proposed constitution, and another to consider whether a provisional central power should be created until the adoption of the constitution. During the sittings of these committees many heated discussions took place, but nothing of importance occurred, excepting the appointment of another committee to consider the rights of the people. On the 26th of June, the latter and the Committee on the Provisional Central Power made their reports to Parliament. The former issued the following Declaration of Rights: religious liberty, gratuitous education, freedom of opinion, inviolable secrecy of letters, the inhabitant of any state to possess the same political privileges while residing in another, right of petitioning, meeting, and forming clubs, no political privileges, equality of taxation, independence of the judges, trial by jury, constitutional representation of the people in every state, and the ministers to be responsible, all parliaments to be open to the public. The other committee proposed the institution of a Directory of State, to be approved and appointed by the German Parliament with very extended powers. On the 27th this proposition was rejected, and on the 28th the Parliament decided upon appointing a Lieutenant General of the Empire to be perfectly irresponsible. This also enacted that, on the appointment of the Lieutenant General of the Empire, the existence of the Diet was at an end, and further, that on the completion and adoption of the Constitution for Germany, the provisional central power should cease. On the 29th, the Assembly proceeded to the election of the Lieutenant General. The choice fell upon the Archduke John of Austria, who was uncle of the Emperor of Austria, liberal in politics, and a thoroughly practical man. But little space remains for a brief narrative of the events in Schleswig-Holstein. A long, narrow, sandy peninsula comprises the two duchies and Jutland. For more than a century, the two former have been under Danish rule, though they always considered themselves as governed by the King of Denmark in his capacity as a sovereign prince of Germany. Long dissatisfied with the Danish rule, and more particularly with a recent refusal of the king to concede to them any of their demands, they declared themselves independent of Denmark and a German duchy on the 26th of March under the sway of the Duke of Augustenburg. The provisional government sent to Hanover, Berlin, and Hamburg for assistance, which was granted from the two former, and before the 3rd of April more than 13,000 Prussians and Hanoverians had entered Holstein. The inhabitants had already possessed themselves of Rendsburg and had expelled the Danish authorities. The Danes were not behindhand with their military preparations, and very soon had an imposing force in the field, while the extraordinary popularity of the war in Germany brought shoals of volunteers from even the southernmost states of Germany to the assistance of their enemies. At Flensburg an engagement took place between the Holsteiners and Danes, in which the latter were victorious. Nearly 20,000 Prussians and Hanoverians, besides volunteers and Schleswig-Holsteiners, were now under arms against the Danes, whose forces were nearly equal. During the months of April and May, a great many skirmishes occurred, with variable success, 1 or 2 general engagements at Schleswig and Appenrad, and one which lasted 2 days at Dupeln. The Danes were driven northward, and the combined troops were at one time in possession of Jutland. The island of Alsen was also the scene of an engagement. Though beaten and driven back on land, the King of Denmark made several reprisals at sea. He blockaded the whole northern coast of Germany. His vessels of war took possession of the rich merchant ships returning to Hamburg and Bremen, an incalculable loss to the Hansa towns. Sweden commenced preparations for the assistance of Denmark. Russia was reported to be doing the same. The Diet at Frankfurt rejected all offers of mediation for a long time, and the national feeling in favor of the duchies was beginning to flag. By these united efforts, an armistice for 3 months between Prussia and Denmark was effected, which was concluded at Malmo, between Count Portalis on the part of the King of Prussia and the Swedish and Danish ministers. The conditions of the armistice were that the German and Danish troops should withdraw, and that the provisional government should act until a new administration could be formed from the duchies, 2 members of which should be nominated by Denmark and 2 by Prussia, a president to be selected by the 4, or in the event of disagreement by England. The duchies declined yielding to this arrangement, and General Mangel, who claimed to be a Confederate as well as Prussian general, was unwilling to comply with it until he should be empowered from Frankfurt. It was therefore apprehended that hostilities would recommence, although Lord Palmerston was anxious that the truce should be maintained. It remains yet to be seen whether Denmark is to be further dismembered, or whether the Germans are so bent on obtaining the maritime territory of Denmark to strengthen their naval power as to risk a war. End of section 83.
Section 84 of History of the Revolutions in Europe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Filippo Gioachin. History of the Revolutions in Europe by Christoph Koch. Translated by Maximilian Schell. Revolutions in Italy, AD 1848. At the death of Gregory XVI, the political affairs of Italy had reached a point which imperiously demanded reform. Thousands of her citizens were exiled in foreign lands, and the prisons were crowded with political offenders. There was no public institution, and justice was unattainable. On the 16th of June 1846, the conclave of cardinals, assembled for the purpose of choosing his successor, declared the Cardinal Giambattista de Mastai Ferretti, also Bishop of Imola, elected under the name of Pius IX, and on the morning of the 21st of June, the new Pope was solemnly crowned at St. Peter's in the Vatican. Pius at once commenced those reforms throughout his dominions, whose progress attracted the attention of the civilized world. He suppressed the military warrants, a kind of secret tribunal, for the seizure and condemnation of political offenders, and published a decree that no one should be prosecuted for his political opinions. On a certain day of each week, he gave a public audience to persons of every rank and condition, without any distinction. In the hall of the Vatican, he caused a private letter box for himself to be placed. He had filled the office of Pope for 1 month when an amnesty was declared for all political offenders. This event was followed by festivals and illuminations, continuing many days, both in the Roman states and other parts of Italy. To relieve those who had been ruined by imprisonment, the Pope joined with many others in a subscription for their benefit. The joy of the Bolognese was so excessive that they voted a marble statue of Pius IX. Political parties throughout Italy resolved themselves into one great party of the Pope. By a circular issued by the Secretary of State, Pius invited from all the magistrates suggestions for the instruction of the poorer classes and for the suppression of the miseries of idleness and ignorance, and a committee was appointed for the investigation of the subject and for the establishment of the desired reforms. The income he received from the bishopric of Imola was appropriated to public charities. He solicited from private companies of citizens projects for railroads in the Roman states for the promotion of industry and commerce. Resolving to publish a new code of laws in place of that existing, as old as Popery itself, he appointed 3 eminent men to assist in its compilation, and judicial and penal systems which abolish capital punishment and establish trial by jury were adopted by them. By order of the Pope, every town sent a delegate to Rome to report concerning the wants of the people, and a private congress was established to grant all necessary improvements. On the 18th of November, he preached to a vast crowd assembled in San Giovanni in the Lateran, and afforded the first example of a pontiff's preaching publicly. He was followed to the Quirinal Palace by the multitude with shouts of joy. On the 20th of the month, he proclaimed a universal jubilee. He gave orders to found asylum of infancy and houses of education, and for laboring people in Rome who could not attend by day, he established free night schools at his own expense. He prohibited beggary, and at his own cost endowed public almshouses for the destitutes. In a letter to the leaders of all the religious orders, he commanded them to be examples of morality and religion, and the funds of many religious societies he applied to public charities and instruction. The freedom of the press was declared amid the rejoicing of the whole people, and the friends of liberty throughout Italy encouraged the Pope in his system of reform. The Emperor of Austria, alarmed by these movements, used every measure to change the course of the Pope, and at length threatened an invasion of the Roman states. Accordingly, on the 19th of July, 1847, the Austrian army entered Ferrara with lighted marches, as if moving against an enemy. The news of the occupation of the city excited such a spirit of revenge that in many states the people were clamorous for arms. In the course of a few weeks, although there was no outbreak, no open display of force, the whole aspect of Italy was so changed that the papal nuncio in Vienna was enabled in the name, not merely by the papal states, but of all of Italy, to demand the withdrawal of the troops. On the 23rd of December, the Austrian troops were marched from Ferrara, and the right of all the states of Italy, not under Austria, to choose their own forms of government was established. Charles Albert, King of Sardinia and Piedmont, was the first Italian prince who favored the new pope and his policy and offered him military aid against his enemies. The pope and the Grand Duke of Tuscany and Lucca formed an alliance with Charles Albert. The publication of the convention of these princes set forth that these states, animated by the desire to contribute by union to the increase of the dignity and prosperity of Italy, and being persuaded that the true and essential basis of the union of Italy consists in the fusion of the material interests of the population of their respective dominions, have agreed to form an association on the principle of the German Commercial League, the tariff to be drawn up with the utmost amount of commercial freedom, compatible with the respective interests of the contracting powers. The news of this convention was received throughout Italy with enthusiasm. It was a revolution, a return to the ancient free trade policy of Italy, and brought with it hopes of the restoration of commerce and the revival of trade and industry. Throughout Austrian Italy, the impulse was felt. It made the trade repression rule of the foreign power more irksome. At the close of last year, the Austrian cabinet resolved to reinforce the army in Italy, so as to have 40,000 men at command without lessening the strength of the several garrisons. The measure was notified of the great powers as being intended solely for the better security of the Austrian possessions in Italy. On the 19th of December, M. Nazari, deputy of the city of Bergamo, in the central congregation of the kingdom, moved a resolution that a committee be appointed to lay before the Emperor of Austria a project of reform for the Lombardo-Venetian kingdom. The motion was founded on the universal discontent of the country. It was opposed by the governor of Milan, president of the congregation, who declared that the viceroy himself was engaged in preparing a project of reform. Nevertheless, the resolution was passed unanimously by the assembly. The committee was appointed, and the inhabitants of Milan crowded to the residence of Nazari to inscribe their names as an expression of approbation and respect. The committee consisted of deputies from Como, Milan, Cremona, Lodi, Brescia, Bergamo, Mantua. But neither in answer to the committee nor as the invention of the viceroy was any reform promulgated or even promised. Instead, troops continued to arrive, and the directors of the Imperial Iron Foundry at Mariazell in Austria announced publicly that for 6 months they could not execute any private orders, as night and day the entire works would be employed in casting cannons and millions of projectiles. At Pavia, the university was provisionally closed. A fight took place between the students and Austrians. 6 or 7 persons were killed and 30 wounded. At Turin, on the 14th, a grand funeral service was celebrated in the church of La Gran Madre di Dio, in commemoration of the patriots murdered at Milan and Pavia. The most respectable inhabitants, dressed in deep mourning, assisted at the ceremony. A similar funeral ceremony was celebrated in the church of the Lombards at Rome, the Pope permitting the demonstration which the Austrian ambassador had vainly endeavored to prevent. The young men belonging to the Lombardo-Venetian Guard, instituted in 1838 at the coronation of the emperor at Milan, all tendered their resignations. The theaters were deserted, and the expression of hatred to Austria and condemnation of the conduct of the police, military, and government were universal. At Venice, notwithstanding the prohibition of the police, ladies made a collection for the wounded of Milan, and 8,000 francs were forwarded, with a letter of sympathy from the Venetians. The mayor of Vicenza forwarded 2,000 francs from the inhabitants. At Verona, 1,600 francs were subscribed in 8 hours, when the subscription was stopped by the police. On receipt of the news from Milan, orders were dispatched from Vienna, and followed by the arrest of several distinguished individuals. In addition to these, as the lower orders were this time discontented, upwards of 400 of them were apprehended. 180 of the youngest and most robust were sent to Trieste to serve in the ship of the Imperial Navy, and the remainder, without even a form of a trial, were transported to Illyria and Moravia to work as galley slaves. 30,000 troops were quartered in Milan, 10,000 in Verona, and the regiment of Juliet, of disgraceful notoriety in the massacre of Galicia, was quartered at Pavia. The emperor wrote to the Archduke Rainer, viceroy of the Lombardo-Venetian kingdom, "I have duly examined the events which occurred at Milan on the 2nd and 3rd instant. It is evident to me that a faction desirous to destroy public order and tranquillity exists in the Lombardo-Venetian kingdom. All that you deemed necessary to satisfy the wants and wishes of the different provinces, I have already done for the Lombardo-Venetian kingdom. I am not disposed to grant further concessions. Your Highness will make known my sentiments to the public. The attitude of the majority of the population of the Lombardo-Venetian kingdom, however, induces a hope that similar distressing scenes shall not again occur. At all events, I rely on the loyalty and courage of my troops." Signed, Ferdinand I. This letter was interpreted by General Radetzky in an order of the day issued to the troops under his command, in terms the most outrageous and offensive. The letters of the emperor and his general had some effect. On the 21st of June, 300 of the most respectable inhabitants of Milan applied to the police for their passports. Everybody dreaded a second Galicia and was eager to leave the country before the fury of Austria might break forth in pillage and massacre. During the course of these events in Venetian Lombardy, the subjects of Ferdinand of Sicily also demanded extensive reforms. A promise that public offices in Sicily should be filled by Sicilians had been openly broken, and that the people might have no opportunity of remonstrating, the liberty of the press had been abolished, and all foreign newspapers, even those of absolute governments, had been prohibited. The people petitioned for reforms, and were put off with promises. At the commencement of the present year, Ferdinand of Naples became active, presided daily at councils at which the state of the country, the deficit in the finances, and the need of the immediate abandonment of the old, worn out, and hateful political forms were eagerly discussed. It was argued also that the army should be diminished. Ferdinand felt it no easy matter to let go absolute power, to abandon the notion that the people of Sicily were born to obey him and pay him taxes. Their demands were, therefore, from day to day adjourned, until their patience could endure no longer, and the popular dissatisfaction broke out into open rebellion. There was some hope in Sicily and Naples that on the king's birthday the new and repeatedly promised constitution would be declared. The result of the final extinction of these expectations was the outburst of rebellion in Palermo. Nobles, students, women, priests, the whole populace, determined to be trifled with no longer, turned out and fought. The garrison took refuge in the palace and small forts about the city. These forts were attacked, and the whole of Palermo, and it might be said all Sicily, fell into the hands of the insurgents. The news threw Ferdinand into a fever of rage and fury. A reinforcement of 4,500 men were ordered to embark immediately, and under the command of Count d'Aquila, the king's brother, landed at Palermo on the 15th. But the count did not dare to risk a battle with the people. The troops remained in the forts and during 48 hours continued to fire upon and bombard the city. The people, however, were not to be conquered. They attacked, and by fierce fightings took the fort of Castellammare. The whole populace were of the point of rising. The king's brother returned to Naples. His report convinced even the king that immediate concessions must be made. The Palermitans demanded and obtained the proclamation of the Constitution of 1812, which of right had belonged to them ever since that day. On the 29th, the Constitution was announced at Messina, on the 30th at Palermo, and on the same day, steamers were sent to bring back the troops. At Naples, meanwhile, popular feeling, excited by the events in Sicily, had reached such a height that there was no safety except in granting a constitution there also, which was accordingly published on the 28th, and on the 8th of February, a constitution was proclaimed in Sardinia. Throughout Italy, the progress of these events was watched eagerly, and the accounts welcomed with the utmost enthusiasm. At Genoa, there was a popular rejoicing, and the shout of the people, heard in all directions, was, "A constitution for Piedmont!" At Rome, the people crowded out for miles to meet the couriers on the Via Appia, and extraordinary supplements were issued hourly by the newspapers. A fete was held to celebrate the triumph of the liberals. There was a similar fete at Florence, and at nearly all the other great towns of Italy. In Lombardy, the people, beset by 100,000 soldiers, scarcely dared to rejoice. Austria was marching more troops upon them. The little army of the Duke of Medona had been incorporated with the Grand Duchy and placed under the command of General Radetzky. On the 29th, 30th, and 31st of January, the railroad from Treviglio to Milan was closed to the public, being exclusively occupied with the conveyance of troops from Lombardy. The army was to keep back the tide of opinion rising throughout Italy. There was no chance of peace but in submission, no hope of reform under Metternich and Ferdinand. But this gathering army and the gloomy adherence to relentless tyranny increased the hatred of Austrian rule and enlisted universal sympathy for its victims. At the Bologna fete, to celebrate the proclamation of the Neapolitan Constitution, the popular cry was, "Live the Constitution! Death to the Austrians! Let us march to Lombardy to assist our brethren." But the case of Lombardy seemed hopeless. The army had been increased to 110,000 with 700 cannon. Arrests were incessant. The prison of Milan was crowded. Numbers were sent to the house of correction at Porta Nuova. The Austrians were everywhere insulted. It was evident that the storm of popular indignation must burst forth soon, that the struggle would be a fierce one, though it was scarcely possible to believe the Italians could be successful. The outbreak was hastened, and help came to them from a quarter altogether unexpected. Austria was the first to feel the revolutionary impulse given by France. The whole policy of Metternich fell before it, and he himself had to escape in disguise from amongst a people to whom he had so long been a source of terror. With his fall, absolutism perished, and the will of the people was acknowledged. A constitutional government was declared at Vienna, but it was too late to save the dominions in Lombardy by any Austrian form of government. On the 17th of March, the Austrian viceroy left Milan and met on the road the courier with the intelligence of the popular triumph at Vienna. On the 18th, the Milanese seized on the military post at the palace of the governor and began the construction of barricades. Carriages were seized upon and overturned. The pavement was torn up. Not a soldier was to be seen, and the barricades were finished during the night. On the morning of the 18th, the fighting commenced. The fire of cannons and musketry was kept up all day. The artillery planted in front of the cathedral and palace were seized by the people. A provisional government was formed, and the fighting continued on the 20th with doubtful success to the people, who, notwithstanding the support of the body of Swiss, were forced from the center of their movement. On the morning of the 21st, they regained their position, took possession of the powder magazine, and planted a cannon in the tower of San Celso. General Radetzky offered to treat with the provisional government, but was refused, unless on terms of unconditional surrender. A deputation was dispatched to Turin, demanding assistance, which was at once granted, and the Piedmontese force, under the command of the Duke of Genoa, crossed the frontiers and advanced upon Milan on the 22nd. The Austrians retired before it and left the city garrisoned by its own citizens and the auxiliary forces of Piedmont. On the 18th, the people of Parma rose suddenly and took possession of the chief posts in the city. On the 20th, after some fighting, the Duke issued a proclamation declaring the appointment of a council with supreme authority to give such instructions and adopt such measures as the circumstances might require, whilst he and his royal family quitted the states. On the same day, the Duke of Modena was deposed and imprisoned, and the Austrians were driven out of Pavia. On the 19th, Venice, Trieste, and Padua were in open insurrection. Rebellion also spread throughout Vicenza, Treviso, and the whole of the Venetian territory, as far as Verona. On the 22nd, General Count Ziegler capitulated with the provisional government of Venice and set it free from the domination of the Austria. The King of Sardinia, Charles Albert, issued a proclamation taking Lombardy under his protection, marched an army to join his forces at Milan, took the field boldly to drive Austria beyond the Alps, and virtually proclaimed himself the liberator of Italy. The Austrians were driven beyond the Mincio at Goito and compelled to surrender Peschiera. On the 1st of March, an insurrectionary movement took place at Rome, in consequence of its being understood that the Pope, influenced by an intrigue amongst the cardinals, had refused to declare war against Austria. The people had allowed him the previous day to form his resolution, and at 5 o'clock in the morning the whole city was on foot in eager impatience. The answer was that war would be formally declared, and as the people had also demanded a complete separation of temporal and spiritual affairs, that no priest should be appointed to fill any public employment. That Pius IX was the head of the government, that a daily official bulletin would be published of the events of the Great War, and encouragement given to the Roman youth to arm to drive the barbarians from Italy. This satisfied the people. The ferment was calmed, and all classes were united. On the 13th of April, the Sicilian parliament passed by acclamation a decree that Ferdinand Bourbon and his dynasty were forever fallen from the throne of Sicily. Sicily should govern herself constitutionally and call to the throne an Italian prince as soon as she shall have reformed her constitution. The list of candidates for the throne were a son of the King of Sardinia, the son of the Duke of Tuscany, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, son of Lucien Bonaparte, and the Prince of Beauharnais. Enraged by this boldness, the King of Naples declared war against Sicily. From first to last, the conduct of Ferdinand was false and treacherous. No promise was kept, and every opportunity was grasped as to weaken or retreat the liberal measures he was forced to yield. The commons had been returned, but no peers had been elected by the people. On the 15th, the houses were to meet. No peers had been named up to the 13th, but on the 14th, a proclamation appeared, emanating from the king, nominating 50 members of the House of Peers. Immediately on the publication of this document, the Commons met privately and agreed to address the National Guard on the encroachment of royal authority. On Saturday, the 13th of May, the deputies were assembled in preparatory session to modify the form of oath to be taken at the opening of the Parliament. The oath was, "I swear fidelity to the King and the Constitution of the 29th of January." The deputies refused this form as not being in accordance with the concessions of the 3rd of April. The National Guard, numbering 15,000, objected, and Saturday and Sunday were passed in negotiations. At 11 o'clock on Sunday night, it was announced that the king would not modify the form. 8 deputies met, declared the sitting permanent, and sent a deputation to treat with the king, but without success. Another deputation was sent at 12. The king asked time to consider, and at length pretended to accept a modification of the oath, reserving the rights of the 3rd of April. Meanwhile, the troops had been ordered out. Soon after midnight, the National Guards began raising barricades. At 1:30, the generale was beaten, and at 2, the troops, cavalry, infantry, and artillery occupied the spaces round the palace, castle, and marketplace. On being informed that barricades had been thrown up, the king ordered the withdrawal of the troops and promised that the parliament should be opened without any oath. But it was not to be believed, and the National Guards refused to lower the barricades unless the chambers of peers were abolished. The fortresses surrendered, and the troops removed from the metropolis. The soldiers were called out again, and at 9 o'clock the Swiss guards were drawn up round the castle. A musket was discharged by accident. The National Guard commenced firing. The Swiss and artillery opened a murderous fire upon the people, and the battle raged in all directions. At San Fernando and San Brigida, the National Guard maintained their ground for 3 hours under an incessant fire of musketry and artillery. The town was given up to pillage and massacre. At a preconcerted signal, the troops burst into house after house, and without regard to sex, massacred the inhabitants. At the last accounts, Great Britain had offered to mediate between Austria and the Italian states, and hopes are entertained that the settlement of the difficulties in Italy will soon be realized. End of section 84. End of the Revolutions in Europe by Christoph Koch, translated by Maximilian Schö.